So hi everyone. The work I'm presenting today, I did have some help with. I didn't do it on my own. So Jack from DataRock helped with this, as well as Mark from the Geological Survey of South Australia. Okay. So airborne geophysics can assist in large-scale geological mapping, but the data can be quite hard to interpret and relate back to the lithology, particularly when there's limited ground truth due to varying cover thickness. So in this study, we looked at if we could demonstrate how computer vision-based feature extraction can be combined with unsupervised community detection models to extract geologically relevant information from airborne geophysics. So we tested several methods on an area where the geology is considered to be relatively well understood. So this then enabled a comparison between the results from the clustering methods and the known geology to help decide which algorithm was working the best in this area and would be best to apply to less well understood areas. So the test area for this project was part of the Gawler Craton in South Australia. It contains Archean to Proterozoic basement, mainly metamorphic felsive magnetic and bimodal magnetic units. So the extensive sedimentary cover, there's not a lot of outcrop of this, including the Neoproterozoic Stuart shelf in the northeastern region. So the Gawler Craton contains significant economic mineralization, including iron oxide copper gold and organic gold deposits. This test area here, because we're only using part of the craton, does not contain IOGCs, but is considered quite prospective for nickel sulfides. So the data used in this test is airborne gravity and total magnetic intensity that was vertically reduced to pole. In case anyone's not familiar with this sort of data, airborne geophysics is geophysical data that's collected from either a plane or a helicopter that flies a survey pattern across an area. So in this study, we used just the two inputs, but any other airborne geophysical layer or even some ground layers could be used. It just depends on which layers are available and which provide the most information about the lithologies that you're interested in. And each data layer in our test was divided into 2 kilometre overlapping tiles for the processing. So in this study, we compare the results to the basement lithology. However, airborne geophysics is affected by all rock units and also man-made objects below it. And therefore, not all information in the data will relate to these lithologies. Additionally, some lithologies will have very similar geophysical responses. Just because they're labelled as something different, they could be quite similar geophysically. And therefore, the lithology boundaries won't necessarily be representative of the geophysics. So in these plots, you can just see I've put the outlines of the basement lithologies against geophysics. Some lithologies align quite well with the units. So, okay, so you can see this sort of purplish area along here is quite divided. We've got some areas, yellow areas here that are quite distinctly matched, but we've got other features in here, say, that don't correspond to any of the boundaries and are produced by something else. Yep, so this is just an example showing the way the 2 kilometre tiles are there. So you can see there's quite a strong overlap. And this is some of the initial ones. So data down here is missing because this is over water, so the ocean. So any tiles didn't fully contain data are removed before the processing step. So each 2 kilometre tile is then passed through a pre-trained convolutional neural network. These models are trained to recognise everyday objects, cats, dogs, cars, all sorts of things like that. However, in this case, instead of taking the last discrete object classification from the labels, which are the ones over here, you can actually take this layer beforehand. And this basically, each layer or each little output in that describes something about the texture of that image or shapes present in the data. So this results in 256 features for each geophysical data layer. So these are then reduced using a UMAP, or a uniform manifold approximation projection. So a UMAP is a technique designed to reduce high dimensionality datasets in something that's more computationally statistically appropriate. It can be used in a similar way to something like TSNE, but it's better than TSNE at handling large large data sets and has better preservation of the overall data structure. So it's great for things like nonlinear relationship, outliers, and high variability in the data. And it maintains local and global relationships within the data. Basically, it constructs a very large high-dimensional graph of the data in its original form, and then it builds a lower dimensional graph that retains much of that structure from the original large graph as it can. You can then take that UMAP graph and apply network-based clustering by things called community detection algorithms that instead of using just the data points, actually use that graphs for the clustering. So this is very typical. If you look at UMAPs, you'll probably see this diagram. So where basically you've taken a 3D point cloud of a woolly mammoth and you project that onto a 2D UMAP projection. So the color codes stay the same. So you can see, say, the tusks here have stayed together and the tusks here that connect to the points that represent the head. And if anyone's interested in looking a bit more about UMAP, that Understanding UMAP website is a really good place to start. So in our case, we reduced dimensionality from 512 to 80. So this graph on the right is our data. However, in this case, I've taken it down to 2 dimensions. I can't visualize 80 dimensions, but you can just see how you can see where the points are connected and how it's not just showing points or data, it's actually showing the connections between them. So I have tidied this up using edge bundling, but you can see how sometimes points that might be quite similar together are actually not directly connected. It's these connections that are used in the clustering later on. Yes, so community detection algorithms use a graph produced by UMAP or something similar to set groups with similar properties and connections. So as opposed to something like a k-means or other clustering algorithms, community detection algorithms use these connections as well as the locations. And so they use something called modularity, which is a measure of how comparatively dense the edges or the connections between the groups are compared to the density of the connections between different groups. So they're hierarchical methods and they automatically detect the correct number of clusters for the data based just on the data. You can change some settings that will give you more or less clusters, but you can't say, I want 10 clusters, I think I have 10. So compared to things such as k-means, where you do say how many clusters you want, in this way, it's always driven in some ways by the data as to how many clusters you end up with. So in this particular study, we compared the Louvain algorithm with both the Potts and Duke modularities with the Leiden and Waltrap algorithms. And we compared these results back to those key into early Mesoproterozoic geology that I showed earlier. Because this was such a well-known geology, it can be used as a ground truth to assess the amount of geologically related features that could be isolated and identified by these clustering techniques, and to see which methods produce better results. That figure on the right there just shows a 3D clustering example of our data. So as I said, it's not our final clustering results, but those colors are by one of the clustering algorithms. So why the 3 different algorithms? They use a bit of a different method. So Louvain has 2 steps that it repeats over and over. So it looks at each node and says, would I gain modularity by moving it into the next community over? If that's a yes, it moves it across. It then, once it can't increase the modularity using that network, it then rebuilds a new network between these new clusters and then starts all over again and keeps repeating this process until there's no changes in the network. Leiden is a advanced Louvain where it takes the Louvain method, but it adds an additional step in the middle. So it looks at the clusters the first step produces, and if it finds clusters that have a weak connection in the middle, so it's sort of 2 clusters together, only with a weak spot in the middle, it will split them back out. Waltrap is quite different, so it takes that graph network and it uses random walks to compute distances between 2 different nodes. So it assumes that if there's a densely connected area, the random walk will actually tend to get quite port in that area and give quite a long distance. It uses these distances to calculate to then merge areas that have these quite high distances in the random walks. So some results. So this is the Louvain method using the Potts modularity. It gave 21 clusters. And if you compare it to the geology on the right, some clusters do overlap with a particular region. So this down here, this purple here, is the Upper Gawler Range volcanics. And you can see it aligns fairly well with this cluster here. However, the results are limited by the data. As I mentioned before, some of the geological units will have similar geophysical responses. Some will be small and not have a clear impact, and you'll get some impact from other geological units that are above it. So an example of this, if you can see there's sort of like a stripy pattern coming through in the clusters here, these are aligned with part of the Gardner Dyke swarm, which if I just added on there, you can see those lines are almost entirely covered by this Dyke swarm. So it's quite visible in the geophysics. So if I just bring up here, you can see in the magnetics, you can see these quite distinct lines coming right through here and again down through here. And so this is showing the dikes do have a quite clear impact in the geophysics, and therefore they have a strong impact on the clustering results. So just to put those clusters against the geophysics, you can see some of the more stronger features in the geophysics are better represented in the clusters. You've got, say, this section here quite nicely matches here. And as it comes through in both sets of geophysics, some like these are very clear in all clustering methods, or say this one down here. But here in the middle, where you've got a lot of very small features, you end up getting quite small, quite messy sort of results in the clustering. So using Louvain, but with the Doog modularity, we got 20 clusters, and a lot of these results are quite similar. The Upper Gawler Range volcanics, again down here, are quite clearly visible. You still would have a cluster here and a cluster up here. But the main differences are in this middle section, where you've got a lot of small, different geological units and a lot of noise, where it's a much harder job, and so you do tend to get more different results from different clustering methods. So again, you can just compare those clusters to the geophysics. And again, similar to last results, you get clearer clusters where you've got clearer features in the geophysics. So moving to the Leiden method, in this case, we identified 17 clusters. And again, there were some similar clusters, some in the Gawler geophysics, if you like that. But it's a bit more mixed in the middle, and visually it doesn't seem to match quite as well. I'll get into some other results later. And again, bringing it back to the geophysics, some of those areas are still quite clearly identified in the clusters. It does seem to be picking up a bit more of the smaller features in the gravity, as opposed to doing the more general magnetic data in this case. So going on to the walk trap, in this case we had 48 clusters, which was over double any of the other methods produced, and therefore these results were really quite noisy. And comparing it to the geophysics, this is a little bit hard to compare. There are 48 clusters and 48 different colors in that middle image, and some of them are so close it's quite hard to tell apart. So basically this is a very, very noisy result compared to the other methods, and generally we figured was the worst of the methods we tested here. So just as a more quantitative comparison between the different methods, we chose 3 methodologies that have quite distinct areas, and we compared to the clusters that they intersected in each method. So the lithologies are the Upper Gawler Range volcanics, which I've mentioned a few times, which is this group here, the Moondra gneiss, which is this one up here, and we've also got the Mungela granite, which is this area down here. These little bits up here are actually also part of the Gawler volcanics. So we compared the percent of lithology that was covered by the main. We took the cluster that had the most area within each lithology, and we worked out what percentage of the lithology was covered by that cluster. So the Louvain method using the Potch modularity had the best results. It consisted of getting the highest or close to the highest coverage by that particular cluster, and not unexpectedly, showing the figures I had before, Walk Trap performed the worst. The results did vary by lithology. All methods had similar results to the Upper Gawler Range volcanics, which is mostly an indication of how distinctive that particular lithology is from the surrounding rock, and making it the easiest to distinguish using the data. But the Moondra and Mangila units had much larger variability in results, and not always consistent about which method had the best results. So just having a little bit of a closer look, so this is the Upper Gawler Range volcanics. It's distinctive enough that all methods had reasonable results. Some of the disconnect is we have got a few of those dark units coming through here, and these bits up here did tend to classify often as a different cluster, which is why we're getting in those 80s for all of them. Looking at the Moondra gneiss, here we tend to have a poor overlap overall. This separate band through the middle was clearly something very strongly in the geophysics because it showed in all 4 results. However, if you look at the Leiden and Walk Trap, they do have quite a few different clusters, particularly in the Walk Trap, overlapping, so you couldn't really say in the Walk Trap that this particular unit was identified in any way. Well, if you look at, say, at Louvain, you could say, well, there's other things coming through, but it's sort of in the same area. And so our last one is the Mangila granite. This area down here, again, is over water, so we're not looking at this. But so the Potts and Leiden methods both classified this as pretty much being in one area. The Duke method split it into 2, which is possibly reasonable. You'd have to sort of look at the properties of it. However, Walk Trap had quite a few clusters in the area, particularly up here. And again, is probably the worst method here. So all methods we used identified some clusters that were aligned to the geological units, particularly things like the Upper Gawler Range volcanics, and that was very distinctive. Some clusters were often identified, but not by every method. For example, the Moondra gneiss was frequently identified as a unique cluster, but some methods did better than others. And some of this variation is partly due to how distinctive each lithology is in the geophysical data. Some units have a weak signature or similar signatures in other units, and without additional data, it's just very hard to distinguish them. However, it can provide an indication of where some distinct units are, and where maybe there's some areas that are a bit more geologically complex that are going to need more than just the airborne geophysics to interpret. So in this study, we used a 2-kilometre tile size. However, this can be adjusted. If you're looking for more regional features, you might use a larger tile size where you're picking up bigger structures, bigger features, compared to the more sort of localized features identified by the 2-kilometre tiles. Or if you're looking at, say, a deposit size scale, you might pick an even smaller tile size to pick out some of those smaller features. So in conclusion, the study showed unsupervised community detection methods can provide useful information to assist with geological mapping, but not all lithologies have distinct features in the airborne geophysics, so only some can be identified this way. And while all the methods tested had some success, Louvain with Potts turned out to be the best method in this case when compared to the well-known geological units. So this might be, say, the best method that you would apply first to similar new areas where you're looking at to see what was there when you didn't have the well-defined geology to compare to. Any questions?